Right. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Delta Science Brown Bag Seminar, which is, if you've been before, it's jointly hosted by the Delta Science Program, the Ecosystem Restoration Program, and the Surface Water Ambient Monitoring Program. My name is Garrett Lyles. I coordinate these events for that group of organizations, but specifically for the science program. And thank you all. We have a nice full crowd today, and I'm sure there's a number of people on the internet as well through the WebEx. First couple things, there'll be a sign-in sheet going around just to let us know. We all need performance metrics, so we want to know how we're performing with our seminars. Louder? Okay. It's almost going to the red level of the volume. Be careful. So like I said, there'll be a sign-in sheet coming around for the bathroom. Everyone that's not in there before, the brass bathroom keys are over there, and the bathrooms are around the corner. And then last piece is if the building starts on fire, orderly, out the lobby, out the front doors to Cesar Chavez Plaza across the street. So welcome once again. Today is the first of a three-part mini-series about restoration issues in the Delta. There'll be Campbell's talk today, a talk in 2 weeks by Josh Fierce from UC Merced talking about quantifying floodplain restoration and processes. And then the third talk will be by Robin Grossinger. He'll be talking about the Delta Landscapes Project. So today it's my pleasure to introduce Campbell Ingram, who is the first executive officer of the Delta Conservancy, which he started in that position in March of 2011. The Conservancy is tasked to lead, to be the lead agency of Delta ecosystem restoration, and then in that support efforts to advance environmental protection as well as the economic well-being of the residents in the Delta. Since graduating from Humboldt State in '91 as a natural resources planner, Campbell has held a variety of leadership positions with resources agencies like the Bureau of Reclamation as well as Fish and Wildlife Service. And recently he was the Associate Director of TNC's California Water Project. These experiences have placed him directly into a variety of Delta management issues across the last 15 and growing number of years. And his current role as the director makes him kind of a central component of this complex restoration planning and hopefully implementation efforts that are going on in the Delta. Today he'll be providing some insight about the Delta Restoration Network as well as the current hub proposal that some of you have, and there's a few more copies over to the side. And with that, please join me in welcoming Campbell Ingram.
Well, thank you very much. It's a full crowd. I wasn't hungry until I walked in the door and then smelled those nachos. So if you hear my stomach gurgling over the intercom, you'll know why. So I appreciate that introduction. Garrett put out there really who we are. I think one thing that's a real fine point to notice is that Garrett said we are the lead agency for restoration. And I think it's important that we say that we are a lead agency for restoration. So we're expected to work with the other agencies that are out there to coordinate and integrate and actually do restoration into the future. So I want to make that clear. And then, of course, we have that dual mandate of working to provide economic benefit in the Delta at the same time. So I wanted to, oh, Lauren's in the front row. There are more seats up front. The legislature thought the Conservancy model would be a good model for the Delta, given all the changes that are anticipated in the Delta, a state agency to actually work with the community, develop projects, bring resources to priority issues. As probably many of you know, we were the first Conservancy that was funded in advance of a bond passing to provide funding for the work that we need to do. So the bond was supposed to be on the ballot in 2010, then 2012, and now hopefully in 2014. But that will actually provide significant funding, if it happens, for us to do the work that we're intended to do. So that's all I'm going to say about the Conservancy. And then I'm going to kind of quickly shift to say that what I'll talk about is what is the Restoration Hub, who's developed it, what's its purpose, and then I want to run through a couple of quick examples, and then I'll talk about our strategy for putting it together. But at this point, I want to recognize that I'm really just a vocal piece for this effort. On the next slide, we'll talk about who's behind this effort, and it's a large group of all of the agencies, some of the NGO community, contractors, people that are actually doing restoration design work in the Delta, and the Delta community as well. And I'm just up here, I'm the lucky person that gets to stand in front of big audiences and try to explain it all. So just right off the bat, this is just sort of an introductory. I think it's really important to notice or recognize, and I'm going to go into great detail here, but the Restoration Hub is a voluntary thing. And I'm going to talk about exactly what that thing is. But really, it's a suite of tools in a standing panel. You can think about it as sort of an enhanced DRERIP style process. Some of you might be familiar with that. But it's really intended to insist in ensuring that the best available science and adaptive management are incorporated in landscape scale visions and at the project scale for restoration in the Delta. Ultimately and fundamentally, it's intended to speed up the processes that we have. We know that we have long, involved processes for design and landscape vision in the Delta. We need to work on that. We need to use the best available tools to be able to enhance that, and we're going to talk a lot about that. And then I just want to reiterate the voluntary issue. We're trying to stand up a pilot project here to demonstrate that this suite of tools can be effective and valuable in the Delta. It's not intended to be, nor does it ever actually need to be mandatory. We think if the tool is there and it works, people will want to use this tool. So who developed it? I'll talk a little bit about the Restoration Network. A little over a year ago, almost 2 years ago now actually, in our role as coordinating and integrating restoration, we started talking to all the agencies about restoration in the Delta. How do we coordinate what's happening now, and then how do we scale that up to a good, durable, long-term restoration program over time? Darren, I don't know how much time I had. I mean, I was 20-plus minutes and then question and answer, just so people know you'll have. I really want to hear your questions and answer them. If you've got a burning question at any time, just interrupt, and hopefully we'll have a long Q&A at the end. But there was general consensus with all the agencies that we have challenges. I mean, if you look at the 3 big projects in the Delta today, Dutch Slough, Prospect Island, and McCormick-Williamson, that's about 4,500 acres. And they've been on the books, in the works, for 10 to 15 years each. So we know we've got challenges implementing our current level of restoration, and then, of course, at scale if the BDCP moves forward. So all these agencies, all these 11 agencies, started coming together on a voluntary basis to start to think about how do we achieve restoration, how do we coordinate and integrate restoration, and how do we achieve it at scale potentially in the future. We also had some NGO members, TNC, Audubon, Point Blue, and American Rivers participated. Then we involved some of the consultants, some of the people that are actively out there doing restoration design work in the Delta, ESA, Wetlands and Water Resources, which has now merged with ESA, and MWH. And then the Delta community has been engaged as well. We've had representation from the 5-county coalition, and then also more recently, some representation from Solano County, and also from the, I never say this right, but the North Delta RCDs, the Coalition of North Delta RCDs. So that is the Restoration Network. Again, a group coming together on a regular basis to try to vet these complex issues. How do we do restoration at scale in the Delta? They fairly quickly decided, well, what we need is a framework, sort of an overarching document, something to help us focus and align our agencies in a consistent way. We developed a relatively quick framework, and then out of that framework came this hub proposal, this concept of a restoration hub, which I'm going to go into a fair amount of detail on. But just to show, it's really been a subset of that group, ourselves, the Stewardship Council, the Delta Science Program, SFEI, a couple consultants, ESA, and Newfields, really coming together over the last 5 months, several times a month, several hours a meeting, to really just think hard about this stuff and vet, what's going on in the system today, what are the tools we need, how do we deliver those tools, how do we come up with something that works better in the Delta. And ultimately, that's what we've tried to get to with the development of the hub. We've gone through several iterations. One of the biggest breakthroughs we had recently was the development of this problem statement. What are we fundamentally trying to solve with the hub? And this has been vetted with all the members of the Restoration Network and had by and large, good buy-in to what we're trying to achieve. So I won't read that, but fundamentally, it's we lack the landscape scale vision, our ability to really look at the landscape scale and make sure that we're accounting for all the ecological complexity, the current land use, agriculture and the communities in the Delta, and then the flood protection system. How do we actually have the models and the tools to be able to really look at those things collectively when we're doing restoration planning? We lack sufficient early engagement with the Delta community. We've certainly been hearing that from the Delta community. We've had some Delta community participation in the development of the restoration network, and in the hub, obviously we need more. We lack the modeling, the data inventory, the synthesis tools, the support, and the information sharing and adaptive management. Where do we actually get that in the system as we design projects and move a restoration program through time? And then we lack a standing expert restoration design team to support the timely property scale restoration project planning, develop the long-term restoration visions, and then consider the Delta-wide effects and cumulative impacts of restoration projects over time. So again, all sort of coming out of the problem statement. Think about the number of acres that we are doing currently. This is probably, I know I was going to add this at some point. A good point, just to you know, kind of for a little bit of context, think about what it is we are doing for restoration in the Delta today. We've got the 8,000 acres under the FERPA for the biological opinion. We have the Sassoon Marsh Management Plan, which has just been completed and will start to do restoration. The Central Valley Flood Protection Plan is anticipated to do restoration in the Delta. We've got the remainder of the CalFed Department of Fish and Wildlife ERP program currently active in the Delta, and we have the Delta Plan, of course, that anticipates work in the Delta. So given just that, there's a tremendous amount of restoration happening and coordination integration that needs to be done. And then obviously with the potential of BDCP happening, targets of upwards of 100,000 acres have to, you know, really take it to the next level too. So, hey, I did that just right on where I wanted to. So what is the Restoration Hub? Sorry, I'm just going to peek at my next, okay. So what is the Restoration Hub? This is just a diagram, but I'm going to kind of walk you through and talk you through this and a couple of examples. At its heart, the Restoration Hub is a big data platform. Many of you are familiar with that term, data analytics, graphics, the ability to use data in new and innovative ways. And the best example of that we often use is your cell phone. So this thing has every song I want on it, every picture I've taken, videos, it's got all my email, it's got maps, it can guide me to anywhere in the world, it's got a phone, and it's in this incredibly handy little platform that takes all those disparate data sets and brings them together in a way that is incredibly powerful. I mean, you think back 15 years ago, you know, absent this, you know, how this has revolutionized our lives. So think about big data platforms in that way. It's a way to take huge data sets, all the data that we have in the system, all the models that we currently have, and models that we'll develop into the future, bring them together in much more productive ways so that we can use them much like we use our cell phone. So that's just the general concept. Then we start talking about workflow. It's the ability to have those data sets and those models come together with skilled analysts, people that are really skilled at bringing those data sets in and then using those data sets, but coupling that with experts. So we're talking about creating a standing panel of experts that would have the scientists, it would have the agency participants, it would have Delta community participants that would allow us to really take all that information and use it very real time and transparently and sit there and game and test each other's assumptions about how things ought to be done for restoration in the Delta. So that in a nutshell is sort of the general concept. It really allows for a real-time, transparent process, and we hope that that helps us speed these processes up. We want to work really at two scales here. We want to look at the landscape scale. How do we use a process like this and this tool to look at the landscape vision and think about the DRERIP models that we have, the historical ecology, be able to hold the complexity of the ecosystem and everything we know about that ecosystem and overlay that on the agricultural system, the Delta system, and the communities that are in the Delta, but also simultaneously look at the flood protection system. So be able to wrap our arms around all of that at a landscape or at a regional scale and determine how best and where we're actually going to do restoration to get the greatest ecological value with the least amount of impact to the Delta ag system and communities and within the confines of the flood protection system. We're also going to work at the project level scale. Same process, I'm going to walk through a couple examples here, one for each, but the same process where a project comes in. And it's that place where we're able to take that project, fit it into the bigger context, use the existing data and tools, and this expert panel in an iterative approach to be able to develop designs for that project. Again, it's a voluntary process. A proponent's going to come in and they're going to say, help us with this design. You've got your expert panels, you've got this best available tool and the data sets, working together to design, come up with design and alternatives to go through the NEPA CEQA process. So two scales, landscape scale and then project level scale as well. So now I kind of want to walk through a few quick examples. So just thought I'd throw up there, this is the FERPA map that they're currently using that shows existing projects and a couple sort of newer projects, the Overlook Club and the Thule Enhancement Project. Again, I want to specify that this is entirely voluntary. We recognize that FERPA has got to move very quickly to get the 8,000 acres done. We want to create a suite of tools and a process that can help them if they see value in that helping. But just as a hypothetical and a somewhat real-world example, I thought I'd use Thule Red as an example here. So Thule Red is actually, I believe it's owned by Swifka. Byron, is that correct? Byron, Swifka, and they're working with consultants to come up with designs. So what would happen would be that I would come to the hub's door, and we would have paid analysts that would go out and locate all the data that's appropriate, any models that are appropriate to that, and start to bring those data sets together in a way within the platform that we can use it to better understand the system and potential designs. We would then bring together the standing panel, and again, that would be representatives from the scientific community, representatives from the regulatory community, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, NOAA Fisheries, representatives from the duck club communities, or some engagement with the local interest to get their on-the-ground knowledge in this process. And we would take concepts, and we would look at those concepts relative to all that data, and collectively and relatively quickly, we would come up with concepts for design. After an initial meeting, you could have a series of time after that where additional modeling could be done, refinement of those efforts could be done, and then you would come back with that standing group with, say, a design itself. And you would start to vet that design, and you would help to develop alternatives to that design as well at that point. So that hopefully through 1, 2, maybe 3 iterations, 6 months or less, you would have a good design that you could point to and say, best available science, adaptive management, a range of alternatives that you think would be valuable or be appropriate for running it through the environmental review process. So contrast that with how we do this now. DWR, others will work on a concept proposal. It'll move along through a process. Ultimately, at some point, they'll convene a work group that hasn't necessarily been engaged in that concept development, and that group has an issue with the concept. So they kind of send it back, and it gets reworked. And then it kind of comes, so you can see where it kind of, you have this process where it kind of goes back and forth. And then as you move forward to agencies, where agencies start to get engaged to look at this, whether or not they can permit it, they come up with issues and concerns as well. And so that then drops it back, and it kind of has to kind of keep going forward and back and forward and back. This isn't, there are numerous problems with why it takes us so long to do things in the Delta with regard to restoration, but I think this is really one of them. And what the hub is trying to do is it's trying to truncate that. It's trying to get all the people sitting around the table initially to vet it. So when you've got NOAA Fisheries and U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Department of Fish and Wildlife sitting there talking about these concepts, if they've got an issue with that concept, they raise their hand and they say, I think this component right here is a little funky. What if we looked at it this way? And collectively, you're working, you're testing these things. I think the greatest benefit here that we're talking about is in a 6-month period, you're working with the agencies and everyone involved on concepts. And when you're done, you've got some concepts, you've got a landscape vision, or you've got a project and alternatives that there's some buy-in to. There's people that they understand that process, they know where it's been, they've seen the best available tools, the best understanding of science, the best models used in developing that. So hopefully there's buy-in, and then that ultimately facilitates permitting and projects moving forward a little more rapidly. So that's at the project scale, and then you think about a regional scale. So take the Northeast Delta, the precedent that's been discussed, the Cassones Preserve, and think about how you would develop a landscape vision for that region using this process. Again, paid analysts available to work, paid analysts available to actually start to compile everything we know about that region. All the models that we've got, sediment transport models, flow models, the three-rib models, the historical ecology, all the data that we've got relevant to that area, starting to bring that together. Then you're going to bring together this standing group of experts, and they're going to be able to look at that data comprehensively, again, looking at all the complexity of the ecosystem, the agricultural overlay, and the flood protection system at once, and start to really envision and look at alternative scenarios and futures to, again, how do we get the greatest ecological value, least amount of impact to the Delta agricultural and communities, and within the confines of the flood protection system. Now, in the HUB proposal, we talk a lot about what are the resources that are needed here. We talk about funding a standing group of analysts that are expert at working the platform as well as going out and getting data sets. We talk about facilitators, people that can really hone in on what we're trying to accomplish. One of the biggest concerns about this or any process in the Delta is that it starts to spin out. So clearly we have to make sure that we're very clearly articulating what the problems are, what the outcomes are, and the scope of information that we're going to focus on so that we don't just endlessly spin our wheels on some of these bigger complex issues. So we're looking at good facilitators. We're looking at contracts to actually pay experts, have them on staff and ready to go, so that ultimately what this brings to the Delta is a suite of tools, best available science, standing panels and bodies, and ultimately free service to use voluntarily to help better develop restoration designs and regional visions. So strategy for how we're trying to move this forward. We've articulated this as a 3-year pilot project. So we want to go out and find resources, funding and resources to be able to create this restoration hub. And again, that's the space and time, it's the tools themselves, it's the analysts, it's the facilitators, it's paying the contractors, some money to potentially develop or think about how you might develop the next greatest need modeling-wise to move it forward. So we have been working from a platform standpoint. We've been working with the Palantir platform for several years. We've done several proof of concepts in the Delta. And for those of you that aren't familiar with Palantir, they are a big data platform. They're a billion-dollar company that has revolutionized many sectors that we come in contact with every day. One of their first projects was PayPal. They took PayPal from a fraud-ridden small system to one that now, is arguably responsible for a large percentage of money moving around the globe in a relatively secure way. The Center for Disease Control now uses Palantir for how they track disease outbreak around the world. Military intelligence and law enforcement have used this platform successfully. In fact, Sacramento County sheriffs now have a Palantir platform that they're using. So they are probably one of the biggest and best, and they're available. And lo and behold, they live right in Palo Alto, right in the Silicon Valley, and they have a philanthropic component. And we've been working with them to identify ways that they could provide donated software and support to that software for the 3-year pilot to be able to help us develop this hub and show how it works in the Delta. We've also articulated a $7 to $10 million ask for all the other components that I talked about for the hub over 3 years. And we've been working with foundations, Campbell, Walton, Moore, Bechtel, and others, because they're very interested in how this big data technology gets incorporated into California water and resource management. So we think that we have a pretty good ask moving forward to find funding and services to make this move forward. I've also put funding request in to my 15-16 concept paper for 15-16 budget for funding to help move this forward. So again, the idea here is we expect no cost. We expect to provide a suite of tools and a place and time to facilitate delta restoration at no additional cost to those that can come in to use it, and do it for 3 years. See how it works. I think we're pretty convinced that it's the workflow in and of itself, combined with the big data platform and tools, are probably one of the best things we could possibly do for restoration into the future in the Delta. I do want to just quickly say that it has statewide implications as well. We've been working with the Nature Conservancy and others. This technology, this process exists, and again, it's revolutionized other sectors. The fact that we're not incorporating it well into California water and resource management is really sort of a shame. We need to be able to take advantage of this tool that is out there. And so we're all the while trying to articulate how it benefits California statewide, but also focus on the Delta as a near-term opportunity to stand this thing up in all its architecture and figure out a lot of the questions about how you make it successful over time. So I think that's my overall spiel. I think I've covered it all. Any questions? Mr. Enright.
Is the hub voluntary?
Thank you for asking that question. Yeah, absolutely. So again, you know, we're looking at this as how do you create what the Delta needs? How do we do restoration more inclusively, faster, cheaper, more efficiently? We think this is getting to that. But absolutely, the expectation is that it's voluntary. The expectation is we'll build it, we'll prove it works, come use it, and eventually, I mean, I really do think that it'll be the go-to tool that people think, you know, how or why would you try to do something absent this process? Next softball question, please. Steve?
Sure, Steve Culberson, Fish and Wildlife Service. Great presentation. I'm all for it. I think you've identified many of the key characteristics that are missing you know, that are missing that keep us from making great progress. So forgive me if I have to sort of throw in now my real-world questions about you know, have you thought about certain things?
Absolutely.
Mostly because I'm involved in trying to get some of these efforts, you know, up and going as well from the Fish and Wildlife Services perspective. Right. And you know, we encounter real-world problems, and so I guess if I were to put on my social science hat, my economist hat, which is admittedly much too large for my head. So you mentioned that hopefully there's buy-in, and so a very practical question: what's the opportunity cost for non-participation?
I was never a good economist.
What I mean by that is everyone is of the opinion, at least publicly, that the current system is broken. Right. We're not capable of producing rapid restoration progress in time frames that are relevant to our management and policy imperative. Right. And yet, we still have the same behavior that keeps this from moving forward more quickly. I'm wondering, has there been any thought to, you know, I don't know, imposition of penalties? You know, so if you don't come to the meetings and if you don't push things forward, you know, now I'm back to my stupid head stuff. But you know, if you're not in the room, you can't say no. You know, you don't have the opportunity to come in later and say, well, now you're not meeting my objectives, and so I say thumbs down to this project. Right. And I haven't been involved for 6 months.
Well, I think the way we're trying to address that is to try to make this inclusive early on. Get the right people with the right expertise at that table, paid, you know, with contracts on an iterative basis to move through this. But it also, you know, this doesn't solve all the problems, absolutely. I think it starts to really get to the heart of a lot of the problems. But I think what you're talking about, too, is a cultural thing. You can get at that to some extent with some of the facilitation. When you start facilitating these meetings, you're creating expectations of those agencies that are participating. The expectation that they're participating in this is their opportunity to vet all their concerns, test different hypotheses and scenarios, and vet those. But then they've got to carry that back to their organization and the people that are going to be working on this project after them and explain what that process was and why they can have confidence in it and why they need to have deference to it. So you know, this in and of itself doesn't get us over that hurdle, but I think it helps us focus on how we do get over that hurdle through kind of secondary cultural push and shift. And I think the restoration network in general is a really good opportunity because everybody's coming together and we're sort of thinking collectively about those type issues, those type of changes that we're going to have to make if we're going to have any hope of restoration at scale.
Campbell, intriguing model, Mark Rent's Integrated Natural Resource Management. A couple questions. First of all, I'll follow up on that question. Is the expectations that when the agencies participate at the level you're talking about, at the very initial level, is that their concerns from their regulatory roles and their regulatory obligations will be addressed during this process, so you don't have to go through a second iteration, which is compliance with regulatory schemes, or I know you'll have to comply, but designed to satisfy that compliance.
So I don't think that, there's no expectation here of limiting checkpoints that are required for any particular project, permitting or checkpoints, or however you want to term it. You're going to have to go through that. But again, I think the idea is that you're facilitating that by having those agency representatives at the table when you're going through it. And hopefully, again, through creating expectations going in, you're saying the expectation here is that you, as a representative of your organization, are well-versed in the permit aspects, the mitigation aspects, the take aspects that are going to be associated with this project, as well as the ecological values that we're trying to achieve here. You've got to set it up and facilitate it well so people have an expectation of what the realm is that they're representing and how that then gets transmitted beyond them after this process. So does that help? Or?
Yeah, it does. I think that's going to be the real challenge as this plays out in the real world, is that transition or bridge over from the development of the project in this voluntary basis to what is the value it buys down the road. And I'm not talking about in replacement of regulatory affairs, that regulatory issues, but that it actually helps address those so the project, as you say, can move along in a timely manner.
Yeah. And again, I think that, given where we are today, the challenges that we have today on that exact issue are overwhelming. Yeah. They really are probably one of the main factors that are fundamentally confining our ability to do restoration, even at current scale. And so looking for ways to how do you facilitate that. It's not a silver bullet necessarily. We think it's pretty well thought out, a good approach to how you might really make real improvement. But again, this is pretty formative too, so other ideas and concepts about how to further address that are certainly well.
Well, one last quick follow-up question. On the, you discussed about the databases, the gathering of the databases. Could you elaborate a little bit where those databases are going to come from, and if there's any truth and verification of the databases as they are gathered in your process?
Yeah, that's a good question. Essentially in the Delta, or for the most part, a lot of the data we have is the data we have. So you can go onto CDEC and you can get, a tremendous amount of data. Some of the proof of concepts that we've done with Palantir, just going out to CDEC and looking at CalSim modeling results and bringing that together in new and inventive ways. Ultimately, you take what you've got, you recognize its limitations, and then you decide which way you're heading relative to those limitations and invest. But again, you're vetting it with more than just yourselves, more than just your consultant and your proponent, but with the experts that can say, well, this model says this, but I'm not really comfortable with that. Let's graph that against this model and see what the real differences are. It allows you to do a much more real-time sort of testing and understanding of data and model performance, and then ultimately decide, okay, based on all of that and all those uncertainties, we think this is the right way to go, and we think this is going to happen, and we think these are the things that could happen in the future that we would have to adjust for. But again, that's a very truncated process. What we do with that now is we sort of leapfrog it. We do it a little bit at a time, and then everybody finds an issue with it later that sends it back to the drawing board. I think that's one of the things that's just causing these 10 to 15-year restoration projects that hopefully we can.
Well, I have a related question. It's basically about that. Can there be some accommodation or budget made for data content? The platform is nice, but it's only, a restaurant's only as good as its ingredients.
Yeah. Well, there are lots of efforts out there currently. I think, the Stewardship Council or the Delta Independent Science, the Delta Science Program just did their data summit. all about focusing on how you manage data and how it, potentially plays into data platforms. So I think there are efforts in that regard, and I think this process here doesn't necessarily really envision significant effort in refining, going back to old CDEC data about, electrical connectivity. Yeah, Lauren wanted to add something.
Well, I just wanted to say that part of the vision is that we'll collect together GIS layers, existing data, and I think through looking at it in an integrated fashion, we'll recognize where there are gaps that do need to be filled. I think that's kind of the content of building new content. I'm not sure if that's
And a shared understanding of what the gaps are and what's missing.
Well, but
that's what you're getting at.
there are some high-priority ones we could identify right now.
Right.
I mean, I agree with you that this process should daylight more of that. But I would think, well, I'm biased, of course, but, that if there's a way that can be interjected into this kind of a process, even if it wasn't really anticipated up front, that it would have a lot of benefit to this.
Yeah. Good point.
How do you propose to get the agency personnel to leave their silos and come and work in this hub environment?
That's the mandatory. No. Well, ideally, we've budgeted a pretty sizable chunk of funding to be able to have standing contracts where we can pay for people's time, even for the agencies. We're hoping that some of the agencies or some, looking at, like between 10 and 15 people where hopefully you've got standing resources and standing contracts that dedicate between an eighth and a quarter of their time, depending upon where we are and when in the system, to really have access to them, to bring them together when we need to bring them together. But that, we've got to work through that. That is going to be a challenge, definitely.
Campbell, I just wanted to know what process you used in trying to come to the conclusion that Palantir was the right platform for this project.
Sure. So we have done, one thing I wish I could have done today is actually do a demonstration. But we've done a couple proof of concept projects in the Delta using Palantir. A company called Newfields we've been working with for several years. We did a parallel process that looked at the basin study that the Bureau was doing, looking at water management and water operations and how they will change with climate change over time. And the Palantir model was used as a parallel process to show how you could do a much more rich analysis than the current methods. It was actually used by the Nature Conservancy and UC Davis and American Rivers to look at some of the modeling that was done for the BDCP, and there's a report out that's available on that. So really, from our experience working with them and understanding that they are really one of the largest and they are likely willing to donate resources, we've focused on them. But we also recognize that really what we're talking about here is a data platform and a workflow. It's that concept of taking that capability with experts and analysts to be able to use that type of platform. We recognize that platform can change in the future, probably will change in the future, and that's okay. But really what we're trying to do is incorporate sort of that concept of workflow and a place where that workflow can actually happen. So off the shelf, it's a good package. They might be willing to donate. So that's why we've ultimately decided that that would be the way to go. Question there?
Have you prioritized the type of projects you want to review in your 3-year process? This is Natasha Nelson with DWR. Are you only doing ones that are in the public realm, or are you willing to do confidential review of lands that the state has not bought?
So we basically have, well, all we've said in terms of deliverables is that for that 3-year hub, that amount of money, we would do 3 to 5 projects that would come through, and that was just sort of an estimate of what we anticipate in the future. And then do 1 to 2 landscape scale visions over that amount of time as well. So that's actually a pretty low estimate of what we could do. We haven't thought specifically about what projects would come. I mean, I don't think we would refuse service to anyone in the system, but we haven't done any sort of prioritization. Again, it's really trying to build a tool and then tell people it's available and let them come and decide whether or not it works for them.
Do you think one of the alternatives that would come out of it is sell it, don't buy it? Or is the only alternative because you have such high impacts to agricultural lands, for instance?
That's a really good question, and it points out another issue. This whole process has, we started this process knowing that FERPA has to move forward. Got to get 8,000 acres done. And that's going to result likely in small projects and with a fundamental challenge of how well they fit into the larger landscape. And that's the reality, and that's where we're going to be for a number of years. As we move forward into the future, there's real benefit in terms of holding land and waiting until you get larger contiguous acreage. You get higher ecological value, significantly less cost in working with levees, and significantly less cost in terms of permitting to do larger scale projects. That's likely where we want to go, but here's where we are today. So we're trying to design the hub to provide value, not make any judgments. You come into the hub with your project and say, I have this piece of land, I think this is what I want to do. I want science and tools to help me understand what best to do and come up with a suite of alternatives. Boom, that's what you walk out the door with. You ultimately then have to decide what, if any, of those alternatives you're going to say is your preferred alternative, and what, if any, of those alternatives you're going to package into your environmental review to move through the project. And again, the benefit there, hopefully, is that you've vetted that with the community of scientists and regulatory agencies every step of the way so that they've got more buy-in as they go through. And again, you've got hopefully the intent here is to bring in that Delta community input as well. So you've vetted it with the community as well.
I just wanted to suggest from the local perspective that two things. One is I think looking at the FRP projects, really, you've said it's a small amount of land. It's a lot of land, actually, and it has a lot of adjacent property impacts and whatnot. So I think, to me, the value of this is really focusing on, could we make the FRP projects, could we make those successful? And if so, could that serve as a platform for future restoration in the Delta? Because right now, looking at just the FRP projects, there's a lot of challenges to moving those forward, and they have to do with regulatory challenges, lack of data, mixed data, as well as lack of community support and a failure to, as of yet, deal with the adjacent property and water impacts. So really focusing on those near-term projects, I think, is a big bite, and I would suggest that that should be funded by the state and federal water contractors since this is their project and their permit obligation. And then I would further suggest that with respect to, like, developing a hub and a process, having the community be involved in that, you could develop sort of a template for good neighbor policies and neighboring landowner protections and things that would probably help make a project successful locally, so that you wouldn't end up with a big, slap in the face years into it and say, oh, it's not going to work for somebody, because you would have already built in the things that folks are most concerned about who are going to be adjacent to these projects.
I think that really gets, again, to the heart and the intent here. It's to take, how do we get the greatest ecological value at the least amount of impact, feasible within the current land use and communities and within the confines of the flood protection program. That's really the heart of the intent here, and those are great suggestions about how to further enhance that. We've been working on good neighbor policy, thinking about, I think the Stewardship Council actually tasked us with working with the DPC to further define those, and we've been, all good information to kind of filter into this place and space where we take that into account when doing restoration design and landscape visions.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll ask one other question. You've used a lot of terms here that are interchangeable with CEQA. Could you just take a moment to, as this plays out, how you see this maybe playing into the CEQA process? Do you see, for example, when you finish this process, that you're well on your way towards the foundation of meeting your CEQA obligations, or how do you see the two interplaying, if at all?
I think ultimately what we're talking about here is the ability to real-time, transparently, with the best available science and tools, vet your preferred alternative, develop your preferred alternative, as well as alternatives that you would carry forward through environmental review, EPA, CEQA. And so again, that's just working, you coming to us, we're working through that, giving you this suite of tools to help do that, and then ultimately you're hopefully in a better position to move with I like to think about it in terms of, okay, somebody wants to challenge your alternatives or your preferred alternative. You can stand up and say, we vetted that. We used the best data, the best models, we worked with the agencies and the community to develop this design, and here's our design, and here are alternatives moving forward. It doesn't, we don't take on and say, okay, we're going to do that CEQA analysis for you. You're going to do it, but hopefully you've got a package that is probably about as good as it gets in terms of helping you get through that process unscathed.
Campbell, have you thought through how you're going to deal with disagreements and conflict within the suite of experts when you're providing a recommendation?
Yeah, I think that, that's really the key. That'll be the biggest challenge. But right now, the way we do it, again, is experts disagree, and it sends it back for another iteration, independent, that creates an issue with another expert somewhere else, and you get in these sort of endless do loops. So absolutely, those contentions, those issues will be there. Good facilitation can help you really get to more the heart of what the conflict is, in real time, working together, so you really understand what the point of difference is. It can help you identify where you need additional information to help resolve that. But again, it gets us away from this sort of diffuse shuttle diplomacy style, which is very time-consuming. Tries to truncate that, bring those disputes to a much more focused point with all the disputes there, and it's theoretically it should work. Doesn't mean it's not going to be hard. But
anyone else? Thoughts?
Actually, Lauren, I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, just in terms of what the science program is doing, hopefully, and others to help promote where there's agreement on science and move people away from just focusing on where there may be disagreement, also help focus research to narrow that.
Thanks, Mike. You're setting me up, aren't you? And just to let everyone know, I am part of this small group that's helping to develop this concept, so I don't have an independent outside view of it. But I think what you're saying is when we have encountered scientific uncertainties and disagreements, we have mechanisms of trying to resolve those, and often it does mean it's identifying an area where we need additional research or additional analyses or studies to reconcile that. So I would anticipate that would come up. I anticipate also, though, in this process, we're going to have encounter fundamental, more policy-type disagreements as well, for which the science program isn't really equipped to deal with those. So that's where we need folks like you, mediators, right?
I had one question in the back there. And then Chris.
I maybe didn't understand everything clearly, but I was just curious, when you were talking about things being free or complementary, where is the money coming from, or who's going to be supporting this in the long run?
Sure. So for the 3-year pilot project, to demonstrate the value, we're seeking funding from a number of places, but first and foremost from foundations. It's very challenging for agencies to commit funding to a pool for multiple benefits, so we thought it would be good to seek bridge funding from foundations to be able to set this up as a demonstration. So we're actively seeking that. I have put in a request in my budget concept paper for 15-16 that we look at the state budget to provide funding for this, trying to link it to the State Water Action Plan, which specifically says that you need to achieve the co-equal objectives in the Delta, restoration being one, and in our view, this is pretty foundational to restoration in the Delta. So that hopefully gets us a start. Long-term, if a water bond passes, I think funding could be used to help keep this alive longer term. And then I also think that if it provides the benefit that we anticipate, we could think about some sort of subscription use to keep it alive and moving. I think we want to, obviously we want to make sure that if it's as successful as we anticipate it'll be, we can keep it funded and keep it active into the future. But that's always a challenge. Chris?
Yeah. So back to Ray McGow's question on any sort of scientific uncertainty moving forward. So we can expect, absolutely, that moving restoration forward is all about managing expectations and managing uncertainty. We're almost never dealing with making restoration changes to the landscape where, that the restoration is completed and then there are outcomes that are manifest and we can see what happened and we're done. That's never ever going to be the case. So when technical people and scientists get together, the discussion is about how the landscape will actually evolve over time. So it could be that if we have a suite of experts in the room, hopefully one of those people is a soil geomorphologist who has particular expertise on mercury methylation and the biogeochemistry of that issue. So there's a long-term sort of played out outcome when it comes to methylmercury. So that person might suggest that this restoration project is likely to liberate methylmercury, and it'll actually flex some of that out into the system for a time while that restoration project is changing into something else by building up elevation and ultimately covering over the methylmercury. Plants are starting to grow. The shape of that system is changing. The way fish interact with it is going to be changing over time. So the scientific controversies are really more discussions about how things play out over time, and it's really the job of best available science making input into adaptive management to lay out expectations about how restoration projects on degraded lands will evolve over time. So really one of our big products is not only to develop alternatives that can be used today, but to also have a long-term landscape vision for how the landscape trajectory plays out, because that's really where the adaptive management game is.
Good. Any last questions? All right. Well, thank you all very much. I hope this was helpful, and just feel free to call Chris, Lauren, myself. Jessica's there. I'm sure there's a few. Who else has had a hand here in actual authorship here? Okay, I think that's, so anyway, we're eager for input. We're eager to hear your concerns, and look forward to working with you all in the future. Thanks.
As you all are leaving, just a quick reminder that we have a somewhat related seminar next Tuesday at Cal PA, and that'll be Dick Luthi from Stanford talking about urban water infrastructure and the Renew It project. And then keep your eyes open for the following ones after that. Thanks.